We are at an inflection point all across the Western world. We face an odious threat, the emergence of a transnational, authoritarian, collectivist, globalist, technocratic elite hell-bent on tyrannical control. We are being eclipsed as a society by the global elite enabled by technology and driven by a statist ideology which threatens to subject people to a level of surveillance and control never before possible. We have reached the point where, absurdly, we may have to admit that the Unabomber was right. Project Mockingbird, Google it, has grown new wings. All of this is propelled by a sophisticated media that weaponizes narratives and manipulates people to the point where they are addled by propaganda and incapable of thinking critically. There is a growing standoff between freedom and autonomy and an all-powerful interventionist government. The old labels of left and right, fascist, socialist, have ceased to be meaningful. However, the enemy we are facing is not a new one. It is the timeless scourge of state tyranny. This ideology, disguised as progressivism, preys on our best instincts, promising a world free from want. This is not a new phenomenon ultimately, but it's the technology and power of the media that have created a resurgence in the West of the authoritarian state. It is underwritten by a neo-Marxist ideology that foments strife and seeks to impose suffocating conformity. Communist ideologies of the 20th century have re-established themselves with a vengeance. It is best described as coercive collectivism. Many people, especially the young, are increasingly turning towards what they call democratic socialism, as if this were just a benevolent, utopian, progressive move towards a fair and free world for the common man. It is not. Democratic socialism is essentially the first big step towards old-style collectivist tyranny. It's just another people's revolution driven by idiots to empower the wealthy and corrupt few. It is motivated, as always, by a desire to improve one's circumstances through bigger and more invasive government rather than personal effort or achievement. It purports to promote fairness or equity, which is really just government-mandated equality of outcome. In essence, it is just rebranded Marxism. It creates exactly the politicized privilege and corruption it claims to eradicate, promoting the incompetent and resentful to positions of power, as it does inevitably wherever it has been tried. The villains, the new hierarchy. The malevolent forces controlling society are now arrayed in a twisted, interdependent hierarchy of plutocrats, financiers, spokespersons, politicians, media, and institutional leaders who share a common statist ideology and who work together to perpetuate an all-encompassing malignant state. To clarify and illustrate, we can view them as falling into the following categories: lizards, clowns, vampires, hyenas, and sheep. Category 1. The lizards, the favorite image of Illuminati conspiracists. These are the overlords, the power brokers behind the scenes, the financiers, the real influencers, the donor class, the World Economic Forum alumni, the senior EU bureaucrats, the CEOs who run the conglomerates that own the media companies, Big Pharma, Klaus Schwab, Larry Fink, Bill Gates, George Soros, the Clintons, the Bilderberg Group, the IMF, the International Bank of Settlements, the UN, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, foreign national operatives, senior Pentagon and State Department staff, leaders of the military-industrial complex. Category 2. The clowns. Public-facing politicians make up the clown class. These are the charlatans who lie to us daily, the ones who offer us platitudes and bromides and soothing words, but who also provoke our anger until it springs from us to be weaponized by the media to promote the establishment's agenda. Congressmen, senators, presidents who are mere puppets for an entrenched political establishment. An overview of our clown politicians. There are 3 types of politicians and 3 attributes that define them together or singly. The 3 types are pragmatists, ideologues, and opportunists. Many fall into one of these categories. Some will have all three traits, but generally one of these traits defines them accurately. The only ones who are effective are the pragmatists. You can view the current crop of politicians and assess them along these traits, and you'll likely conclude that the vast majority are just corrupt opportunists feathering their nest. Category 3. The vampires. Activist officials pushing radical gender ideology onto children, the leaders of the teachers' unions, morally corrupted celebrities who embody our most base and soulless desires, satanic, seductive, self-indulgent, and yet somehow smug and sanctimonious at the same time. The activists enacting DEI programs, the modern-day prelates and pontiffs enforcing the diversity orthodoxy. Category 4. The hyenas, the foot soldiers, people running municipal councils and school boards, the hysterical climate crisis single-issue fanatics, the race-mongers, the rogue, radical, usually Soros-funded activist DAs and prosecutors, promoted to their level of incompetence and cynically and deliberately chosen for their gender and race so as to provide a cloak of intersectional immunity, whereby any criticism, however well-deserved, is dismissed as racism or sexism or both. Their destructive and unfair policies harm everyone, but most of all they hurt the legitimate and competent members of the identity group whose reputation they sully in the process of advancing radical identity politics and state overreach. Racism and sexism are the modern-day heresy and blasphemy. They are used as a cudgel no less fervently than the fear of excommunication on the medieval peasantry of centuries past. Category 5. The sheep, the final category, the bottom of the food chain, the common folk, the cowed, the economically illiterate, the compliant, the obedient, the unthinking masses who are either too distracted or too afraid to speak up, or worse, do not even realize how manipulated they are. The media, the arbiters. Falling across all of the higher-level categories of villains are the most pernicious of all. The media. They are the self-appointed arbiters of all truth, value, and virtue. Once the watchdog of democracy, they have become its gravedigger. These are people who lie for a living and do so to protect power and privilege. They function as the modern-day Inquisition, who brand and condemn heretics to be consigned to the bonfires of public censure. They are the worst of all. They knowingly lie to protect power and privilege. Ideologues may believe their dogma, but the media know better. Their sophistry and facility with language belie their intentions. They manipulate emotions, shape narratives, and mold public opinion to serve their corporate and political masters. They bombard us with curated information, presenting opinion as fact and propaganda as news. They use emotionally charged language to bypass our critical thinking faculties. Language, the purveyor of truth, the bridge to the past, the guardian of sanity, the preserve of common sense, one of the few truly sacred things that binds us together. On every front, it is assailed by misleading terminology, obscuring the truth at every turn. George Orwell, the author of 1984, wrote an essay called Politics and the English Language. It accurately detailed how debasement of language creates debased thought. It should be required reading for the high school curriculum in order to graduate, even though we live in a post-literate society. The gender divide. One issue that is becoming more prominent is the differences in voting habits across the key demographics of race, age, level of education, gender, and sexual orientation. The gender gap is now a chasm, especially in the era of Donald Trump. He is definitely a man's man. Even those who dislike him will concede he has boss or top dog energy. Women generally have a much cooler reaction, but it's important to look at the underlying reasons. Trigger warning. We're going to generalize about gender differences. If you're non-binary or whatever, sit this one out. We're talking about a major difference between men and women. Men typically vote strictly for what they believe is their best interest, sometimes to the detriment of others. Women, however, are more empathetic and in their nature more nurturing and communal. They have a strong, mutually protective instinct. They tend to be more moved by suffering and elevate sharing and principles of kindness and compassion to the top of their list of priorities in a way that men do not. Women tend to have a stronger sense of consensus and are less inclined to be contrarian. No, this is not etched in stone, and it is not exclusive to women, and it by no means implies that men aren't charitable or that women can't be competitive or combative. It likely comes from being caregivers and taking care of children. This is not sexist, it is part of our innate differences. It is also a necessary and profound part of our sociobiology. Women have a nurturing side, so if it's complementary and it's a deeply necessary part of our social fabric, what's the problem? The problem is that it's easier to mislead someone who votes on general principle than someone who votes for what they specifically believe is in their self-interest. Both are necessary. Voting on principle may even be more important, so it in no way implies an intellectual deficit, quite the opposite. But with today's media, people who vote on principle are at a greater risk of being manipulated, and this makes them more susceptible to groupthink. Enemy of the state, Donald Trump as a threat to our democracy. In George Orwell's 1984, the character of Emmanuel Goldstein represents the ultimate enemy of the state. The citizens of Oceania, encouraged by their government, vent their rage and frustration, directing it at a giant screen with Goldstein's face in what is called the 2-minute hate. He forms the basis for a negative cult of personality, the living embodiment of evil. If this seems strangely familiar to you, it's because this is the role that the Democrat political establishment, aided by the media, has bestowed upon Donald Trump, the 45th President of the United States. As an independently wealthy outsider who is not beholden to the political establishment and not dependent on donors, Trump cannot be bought or controlled. This is why the permanent Washington establishment despises him and fear him. He was never supposed to win in 2016, and they got caught with their pants down. They will not let it happen again. Not only has he been criticized, he's been demonized, vilified, slandered, and attacked, using every government and media resource available. They have launched sham investigations, impeachments, lawsuits, and outright malicious prosecution via a weaponized DOJ supervised by the executive branch. Absurdly, a consumer fraud statute has been used against a man who defrauded nobody. He was fined hundreds of millions for taking out loans from a bank that has the ability and the obligation to do its own valuations. Property valuation is inherently subjective. It is an absurd charge, and the AG of New York actually ran on the platform of targeted prosecution. That is a disgrace to the U.S. justice system. It is straight out of the Joseph Stalin playbook and is something you'd expect from a third-world banana republic, not the United States of America. It looks to currently be in the process of being overturned on appeal, which was always inevitable. The goal was to smear him as a crook and interfere in the election. He was also subjected to a fake rape trial funded by a tech billionaire and Democrat donor Reid Hoffman, an Epstein Island visitor knee-deep in DNC skullduggery. The New York DA actually opened a window of opportunity for a clearly deranged woman to launch a criminal complaint years after any statute of limitations would apply. And she did so without naming a time so as to make it impossible for Trump to have an alibi. It is absurd in the extreme. It is appalling and indefensible. After failing to prove that he raped her, she sued him for defamation, for attempting to defend himself and adding some insults in the process. It is beyond Franz Kafka. What's worse is the constant vilification. If you ask a partisan Democrat why they hate him so much, they can't come up with a reason or any concrete examples. The reason? Because the media apply a principle best explained by a business writer discussing public speaking. He famously said, "People won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel." So when lies are told about Donald Trump, even without justification, people still retain their enmity. The thing to remember about DDS, or Trump derangement syndrome, is that once intense emotion is stirred up, people tend to stick to it even if there's no evidence it's true, or even if it's been debunked. Another cynical truth. It's much easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. Censorship. Controlling what people see, hear, feel, and think. The ever more prescriptive deep state is gathering power and preparing not just in America but all over the Western world to extinguish free speech and crush dissent. It is steadily spreading its tentacles everywhere to suppress free speech in the name of protecting its citizens from harmful disinformation. The absurd Orwellian abomination of language. Misinformation and disinformation falls constantly from the lips of burgeoning tyrants everywhere. Why such a mutilation of language? Why not just say lies? Because a person lies knowingly. By using these phrases, it is imbued with an air of epidemiology. People are no longer autonomous, thinking individuals with opinions. Instead, misinformation becomes a disease vector for people who unwittingly spread misinformation and disinformation like a virus. They do it because they don't know any better. They are being manipulated by media. Always far-right media, of course, never by media that supports the authoritarian collectivist political establishment. So they aren't being suppressed, they're being protected. The government will decide for us what is truth and what is propaganda. The people in power will prescribe, authorize, regulate, and oversee the dissemination of truth and censor anything that subverts or opposes the welfare state. Illegal migration. Why are they doing it? How else is the government undermining the rights of its citizens? By devaluing their vote. In every country, but especially in the US, there is a flood of illegal migrants. They are being allowed across the border to flood the zone with new voters, loyal to the Democrat Party. They are being trafficked and bussed and flown all over the country, accommodations paid, cash and employment deals provided, documents and ID issued, all with the intention of creating a permanent and dependent underclass of loyal voters. If you complain, you're racist. But wait a minute, only citizens are allowed to vote. To suggest they're intentionally bringing in illegal migrants for the purpose of having them vote is ridiculous, right-wing conspiracy nonsense. Surely they would not do that and expect to get away with it. Yes, they would. Think about it. They opened up the border during a global pandemic, and during a period where there was a policy of mandatory vaccination, they let hordes of foreign nationals across who were unvetted, undocumented, and unvaccinated. They defend this with a typical Democrat strategy, deflect all accusations using their go-to tactic, implausible deniability. The solution: vote for freedom. Vote for smaller, accountable, more responsible government. Vote for policy, not personality. Do not conflate identity with ideology. Most of all, do not believe anything the corporate legacy media tells you. You are being lied to while the corrupt, parasitic elites continue to concentrate their own wealth and power at your expense. Don't let them. Do not vote for authoritarian collectivism. Subscribe for more.